The works are produced, basically they're laying flat. I have to produce them in a booth, in a specialised or a commercial industrial booth for applying resins, because the resin is actually highly toxic. I use the resin because I like its finish. I like the quality of it. It's actually a translucent material which is then infused with a pigment and is made up of consecutive layers which are applied onto the paint, poured onto the painting and then rocked from side to side. So in many respects it's kind of a Pollock-like exercise without the gesture. So in many respects the weight of the resin, the heat in the booth, all the contingent factors of the environment actually determine how the pigment and how the resin flows across the surface. There's no picture making, there's no drawing as such. It's the materiality, it's the object itself that determines the nature of the image. These works here are incredibly reliant on contingencies which have to do with everything to do with the ambient, the sound, the light, the architecture, everything that surrounds the work also informs it. And these works are very, very sensitive to changing light. And in fact their entire appearance and also the way in which that nature from stimulus to response, how they affect the viewer, can change dramatically with a shifting of natural or artificial daylight. And even as we're standing here, as the light's passing, as the sun's moving with a different trajectory, the nature of these works, colour-wise, experience-wise, will be very, very different. So I kind of wanted the works, to be living entities in some respects, and I want the viewer to be the subject of the work in many respects. I'm interested in a process that can be felt. I'm interested in a process that in some ways has a synesthetic quality to it. In other words, people can read them on a level where it might be, I've had many people walk up to these works and talk about them in terms of taste, some people in terms of smell, and I almost encourage those kind of readings. I kind of like that. And that I actually came through, not so much through looking at the work of other painters, but looking at exponents of sound artists such as Carsten Nicolai, who in some ways encourages the audience to revisit something that they may have experienced through one sense, but to experience it by another sense. He likes to make almost visualised sound. And I kind of became really interested in those kinds of plays of thought and making a process that can be felt, working with something that is actually more about sensation rather than, as Deleuze would put it, a kind of a percept rather than a kind of a conception or a rule or a model of how somebody perceive or experience something. So the works are quite open in that extent. In terms of the meditative kind of aspect, a lot of people do talk about how they're quite calming. I like that. I like the fact that the works are both noisy in one sense in terms of the colour value and their intensity, but in another sense they're actually incredibly quiet. They don't tell you a heck of a lot, or they don't tell you a lot more. They do with a sustained viewing, and what I'm really interested in is slowing that viewing process down, not speeding it up. But in order to do that, in some ways the works have to be seductive. People may refer to them as beautiful, but spend some time with it and they might, their attitude, their feelings around it will change quite dramatically, and beauty won't just become simply a term. And that's what I mean about, in some ways, offering the viewer an experience where they start to question their own definitions, their own way of thinking of how they describe or actually physically have a raw experience. And it's that raw experience which I'm really interested in, that one before they start to in some ways kind of conceptualise or create a model and close down what they're looking at. I consider them to be more contemplative than meditative. Meditative to me is almost a little bit kind of having some transcendental experience. And I think these works don't offer to that. They're too material, they're too much here and the now, too much in the world. There's too much materiality to them for them to be something that takes you on some transcendental kind of trip in some respects. And also on that temporal level of thinking about how we relate to things, I think we do live in a world which is incredibly fast, everything. And I think what painting, or a lot of painting, can offer, I call it slow release. I like that feeling that you're not too sure what you're experiencing, you don't know how to experience it, but you spend some time with it, and in some respects you have to. You kind of put in this position of being forced to actually sort of just slow down and being aware of your physicality, your consciousness, everything around that. In some ways I hope that's what these kind of offer, but I'd prefer to think of it as being more contemplative than meditative in some senses.